Joining me now to discuss what cost of living will mean for Albanese is Herald Sun business commentator Terry McCrann, chair of the Cost of Living Committee, and LNP Senator Jane Hume, and former Labor Senator and Minister Stephen Conroy. Great to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Look, let's get straight into it and start with the Stage 3 tax cuts backflip. Terry, this week Albo will begin his hard sell on the changes, a big tour of Middle Australia. How hard will this sell be?
Well, it's going to be a tough sell, I think, for the most fundamental of reasons, Danica, that, excuse me, nothing actually happens, assuming that Albo is able to get the changes through the Senate until July 1st. So once again, it is a promise, not a delivery. So this is fundamental in terms of the reality of those voters out there in Dunkley, and indeed people, Australians generally. This is a promise that a significant number of them will be getting a bigger tax cut come July 1, but it's not going to actually be delivered. And the reality of cost of living is today, it's now. They have to buy their petrol, they have to buy their groceries, they have to pay those interest rates now. So, excuse me. So the reality is what's going to be driving how people react to the Prime Minister, and indeed reality is going to be driving what happens in the economy.
Well, this is the problem because there's no immediate relief, there's no immediate plans. Stephen, he was elected on this promise and he's lied. How can he come back from this?
Well, there's no question that he will, lose some paint over this changed position. But we'll have a by-election very shortly, 5-6 weeks until the Dunkley by-election. And that'll be the first test about whether Peter Dutton's campaign that Albo's a liar, or the Australian public will get a chance to say, well, we actually think this is a fairer tax cut and addresses some of the cost of the living, hurt that Australia is feeling at the moment. So I think you'll get a real test within a very short period of time of whether, the simple, cheap political line that Peter Dutton will run for the next 5 weeks, or the Australian public will go, no, we deserve this and we're grateful and we support this change.
But how can he come back from this? He told us more than 100 times. He said this, he made this promise. This is him in the last 6 weeks.
Stage 3 is absolutely locked in?
Yes.
There are no circumstances under which you would seek to roll back Stage 3?
No.
Labor will support all of the legislative tax cuts. We won't seek to change those legislative tax cuts.
We support tax cuts and everyone will be getting a tax cut.
People are entitled to have that certainty of the tax cut.
Can you promise to those Australian families the Stage 3 tax cuts will come into effect in July in full?
Well, we haven't changed our position on that, Michael.
I'll ask that question again. Can you promise, as you did before the election, the Stage 3 tax cuts will come in full in July?
Well, I've said we haven't changed our position,
Michael, can you promise, Prime Minister?
I've said I can't be clearer than that. We haven't changed our position.
That's not exactly a promise, PM.
Tax cuts.
It was a promise before the election. Has that promise changed?
Yeah, you can play word games, Michael. Nothing has changed.
Stephen, seriously, how can he come back from that?
Well, as I said, there's no question he's going to lose some paint over the changed position. But the Australian public, when you say how will he come back? Well, in Dunkley, we'll get an indication of whether or not that there's, a huge amount of paint, or there is just an acceptance by the Australian public that this was the right decision. A changed set of economic circumstances has meant that the broader Australian public needed this more than the smaller group that were just going to receive it.
All right,
and Jane. The test of, how can he come back will be in about 5 weeks.
Well, we'll certainly see so. Jane, I want to bring you in on this conversation now because essentially this wedges in the opposition to make a decision on whether it will support the changes or not. What do you have to say to that?
Well, forgive me, Danica, if we decide not to make a decision until we see the legislation, because quite frankly, I think Anthony Albanese has proven himself untrustworthy. We would like to see the details in the legislation before we make a call. let's recall the superannuation legislation. There were so many booby traps in that. There was no way we could have made a decision before we saw that legislation. And he's just proven the point again. Stephen's right. He hasn't just lost paint. He's actually dented the JUCO here, I think, on his integrity. And in fact, let's recall that the last election was fought on two issues: integrity and cost of living. And he has failed both his own benchmarks here, because these tax cuts actually do very little to address the cost of living. Not only do they not kick in until 155 days away, people need cost of living relief right now, but they fundamentally unwind one of the great drivers of the cost of living crisis, which is tax and bracket creep. Anthony Albanese is clearly very comfortable with bracket creep because he's maintained that 37% tax bracket. And not only that, but by Treasury's own estimates, they're going to make an additional $28 billion from this decision over the next decade. This is not a cost of living measure. This is a redistributionist agenda that is being done for political purposes. There is no doubt about that.
Right. So, Stephen, is this a case of robbing Peter to pay Paul?
Look, not at all. I mean, you know, trying to claim that in over 10 years, 28 billion, that's $2.8 billion a year. Like that doesn't even come close to denting anything. So this argument that suddenly is some great new tax impost, I mean, find another line, Jane, because that one isn't going to work. Just because you roll up these numbers together. But this isn't about robbing Peter to pay Paul. Everyone is still getting a tax cut. It's just that the tax cuts are going to be felt more by those below $150,000
But it wasn't what was promised, Stephen, at the beginning.
Before.
He can't just come out. Everyone's getting a tax cut. You're getting a tax cut. It's not what was promised initially. That's the problem.
No, Albo. There's no question Albo will lose paint over this. And the people of Dunkley are a fair cross-section. And this is a seat that Bruce Bilson very successfully held for years and years and years. So this is not a natural Labor seat. The "we hate ScoMo" feeling was as strong in Dunkley as it was everywhere else. So that 6% margin is a much slimmer margin than traditionally. Bruce Bilson held this for years. I mean, this is a seat. Don't you think it's amazing, Stephen?
Absolutely amazing that even though 1 week ago, less than a week ago, Anthony Albanese was saying our position has not changed on these tax cuts. Within a week, he's already come out and said 87% of people in Dunkley will benefit from this. Really? You've done the numbers that quickly, have you? Well, I can tell you one thing. Nathan Conroy said it on the weekend. 100% of the people in Dunkley don't like being lied to. And that's what's happened. He has lied. He's looked Australians in the eye, and over 100 times he has lied. He has failed his own benchmark of integrity. This is fatal for Anthony Albanese's Prime Ministership. All
right, Terry, I want to bring you in on this. Let's talk about Dunkley. As Stephen just mentioned, the margin's sitting at about 6% right now. There's no doubt that Labor's done some internal polling on this. They'd be worried. Do you think that he's rushed this through to create this perception of we're actually helping you because it suits your demographic?
Well, clearly something changed, Danica, because I mean, to pick up on the point that's been made about the lying, the critical thing to make a point about that is that the lying continued after the government asked Treasury to change the tax structure, the tax cuts, because Treasury was instructed to do so, and and the Prime Minister continued to say, no, we're going to continue to deliver them as structured. So that clearly, as you get to the end of 2023, there was serious concern in the Labor Party and in government about the impact of the failure of policy since the election. I mean, we go back to the election and we were told that the government had a plan, the incoming government had a plan to basically cure all the problems that Australians were facing out there. Petrol prices, electricity prices, cost of living, etc. And it hasn't worked. So clearly the government went into panic mode towards the end of 2023, and what's the magic bullet that they thought they could grab for? And it was obviously this package, and it was obviously the promise of putting money in the pockets of a clear majority of Australians. And there's no question about it. It is a shift from a balanced tax package to one that favours lower income earners. And I have to disagree with the Prime Minister and with Steve. Everybody is not getting a tax cut when you take account of the bracket creep that's happened since 2018 when the package was structured. Stage 1, Stage 2, Stage 3. High income earners were going to get some relief from tax bracket creep, and they had to wait till 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the biggest problem. Jane, do you think that Albanese is a one-term Prime Minister?
I think he has to be a one-term Prime Minister. I can't understand how he can come back from this because, let's face it, what is he going to promise next? And how can we possibly believe in that promise? He can't go to a next election, whether it be a promise on infrastructure, on economic management, on budget management, whatever it is, no one will believe him from now on. He went to the last election saying he had all the solutions to the cost of living crisis. It's only got worse since then. Australians are really doing it tough. And the only way you can bring down the cost of living for all Australians is to lower inflation. This government has fundamentally failed in that quest. And one of the reasons why is because its obsession with its energy policy is failing Australians. It's pushing up the costs of businesses, it's pushing up the costs of households, and Australians are paying the price. Inflation, interest rates and bracket creep are what are causing the cost of living crisis, and Anthony Albanese has failed to deal with any of it.
Stephen, what are the chances of an early election over this? Say, for instance, if the Reserve Bank looks at cutting rates middle of the year, is he going to seize on this to try and gain some momentum for himself?
Look, I think there is zero chance. I know particularly those of us who, follow politics closely love a good election. But I think there's zero chance this year. I think they will want to see the Reserve Bank start to reverse their idiot increase that they put up. I think September, October, which is just embarrassing for the new Reserve Bank governor. I think you'll see interest rates start to come off over the next 6 to 8 months. I think by the end of the year you'll see a substantial reduction, and then through again into March and April next year, which is the most likely timing. So I would think that the natural economic cycle is going to move in Labor's favour over the next 12 months, and I think that if you were to call an early election, you'd be wasting a chance to point to we've succeeded in dealing with those issues.
Stephen, then where does it leave the Prime Minister realistically? Is he a one-term PM?
No, I did hear you say that people were already canvassing names. Look, I confess, been in touch with a lot of my colleagues over the last few weeks, being the Christmas period, but I can absolutely guarantee you there is no rumblings, there is no issues, and Anthony Albanese will lead Labor to the next election, and in my view, he will win the next election.
So not Jim Chalmers. What about Jim Chalmers? Is he an option? Is he an option on the table?
Not now.
There is no option. Anthony Albanese will be the Prime Minister going into the next election, and he will win the next election.
All right, Terry, bring you in on this. I mean, it's just not a good look. The PM's been on the nose, of course, since the Voice referendum. The polling isn't very good. How do you see this playing out over the next few months?
Well, I think it's not going to be easy. I'd have to agree with Stephen that I don't see an early election. I mean, my colleague on my right here might like to see an early election, but it's not going to happen precisely because the government's going to be under pressure politically as well as in terms of policy through the course of 2023-4. It's not going to be an environment which the Prime Minister is going to say, whoopee, I can now go to election and win easily. So he's going to be in defensive mode all the way through 2024. And I'd caution people to anticipate against the Reserve Bank slashing interest rates through the course of 2024. I mean, and equally, if we get big interest rate cuts, that doesn't actually announce necessarily that the economy is in great shape. It would probably announce that the economy is actually in bad trouble if we got really serious interest rate cuts, the sort of interest rate cuts that people would actually feel the benefit of. So I think that 2024 is going to be a fairly turbulent year on all fronts. This is not a year for Prime Ministers to get away with slick policy promotions and be able to dazzle the punter. The punter wants reality, and the punter wants reality in terms of their hip pocket.
Immediate relief. That's what they want. It's been great to speak with you, Terry McCrann, Jane Hume and Stephen Conroy. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.